Continuing on now, we've talked a lot in this class about how media are privately owned and are profit driven in the US, but let's now take a moment to highlight that we do have a fairly robust educational broadcasting system as well. And that's because of a law that was passed in 1967 called the Public Broadcasting Act. The Public Broadcasting Act established PBS, the Public Broadcasting System, which is the television side, and NPR, National Public Radio, which is the radio side. And these are paid for, the content that comes out on radio, television that's public, is paid for by taxes. Taxes levied on the American citizen. So they're not allowed to advertise at all. And actually, this act also provided for college radio stations like WESS Radio. So we have a lot to thank for that Public Broadcasting Act in 1967. Basically, it said that we have to have a public broadcasting sector in this country, and we're going to do what we need to do to support that. All right, now let's talk about diversity on television. Television has been criticized for not being diverse. It's better than it was. But TV is criticized for showing people that overall are better looking than the average person, who don't work out, who don't go to work at all, really. You don't see people at the workplace unless it's like the basis of a comedy skit like Two Broke Girls, that TV show, if you know that. And also problems are fixed in half an hour. Crimes are solved, relationships are come back together when they are turbulent at the beginning of a TV show. Whatever the plot is, it's fixed by the end of the show. So there's a lot of complaints about that. And when you looked in 1999, there was a study done in 1999, a long time ago, but the four networks were looked at and only had one non-white lead character in the role. Now, we've seen a lot of changes since then, but there's also the idea of stereotyping of people. Or African Americans, for example, often shown in crime situations or in urban situations. It's not representative of the vast majority of African Americans, as a for example. So TV shows are criticized roundly. And even when the characters are representing a race or ethnicity or religion or sexuality, they're cleaned up in a way to appeal to the masses of people, stripped down, so to speak, to the basics and not the offensive sides removed, potentially offensive sides. Let's talk about Spanish language in television. We have two big Spanish television networks in the U.S. We've got Univision, which is coming out of Florida, and Miami, I believe, is where it's situated. And we've got Telemundo, which is out of New York. And that's actually the fifth biggest network in the country now, is Telemundo. And one of the most popular kinds of Spanish language content areas that we can see on television, not just here in the U.S., but all over the world, is the telenovela. Telenovela, which is like a novel on television, or a televised novel, if you want to think of it that way. Yeah, it's a soap opera. It's a soap opera, but it's not the same. In the American soap opera formula, you have long-running programs like General Hospital, which has been on for decades, and the characters stay the same, and there's a lot of plot lines that are recycled. And I know people who say, oh, I can watch one episode after years and I'm all caught up. Well, it's not like that in the Mexican telenovela. They run for 6 months, and then the characters move on to another one. They're very dramatic. Oftentimes they revolve around a difference between class. Somebody from a rich family is in love with somebody from a poor family, or vice versa. They're watched all over the world, those telenovelas, and certainly here in the United States. The most popular one that came over in the U.S. was cleaned up by American television and redone in its own view of what a telenovela would look like. It's called Ugly Betty, if you ever heard of that show. Let's move on to the BET network now, the Black Entertainment Network. It started in 1980 in Washington, D.C. by Robert Johnson was the owner. It was the first Black-owned network. So we can see a parallel to the newspapers and also the magazines that we highlighted earlier is becoming vocal distribution centers for African Americans and Latinos and gays and lesbians as well, and other minority groups, finding venues within the mass medium that's of concern. And we're talking about television today. Let's move now to talking about TV and society. There's an author, a researcher, a thinker named Eric Barnow, and he says that TV has a revolutionary impact on society because it takes no skill to use it whatsoever, unlike book reading, unlike magazine reading, and you can start it from birth. People literally do put their children down in front of television. And that we watch way too much TV, 7 hours a day, or at least it's on in the background. It's taking away from things like exercise. In fact, the whole way of watching TV is you lay down, You get a bowl of something that you don't are not going to spill all over the couch. It's something you can reach in with your hand and go at repeatedly. So what happens? Chips, they become important in American life. Sandwiches, to an extent. A coffee table, the whole idea of a coffee table is almost a TV related invention. And the sofa itself, a lot of thought goes into where you're going to get reclining parts so that when you watch TV, you can be all comfortable, or where you're going to point that sofa at. So, yeah, Mr. Barneau says there's been a revolutionary impact of TV on society and has not been that good. Now let's talk about standards for television. They have changed over the years. Standards as far as moral standards goes is what content is appropriate. And in the 1950s and the 1960s, you would be pretty shocked to see TV then and what they weren't allowed to do. You had characters on very famous shows like the Dick Van Dyke Show, which was a comedy, and Dick Van Dyke was he was in the advertising world. I can't remember what his job was, but he comes home and he and his wife sleep in separate single beds because that wasn't allowed to be shown on television. Lucille Ball from the I Love Lucy show, she got pregnant in real life and she continued on with the show, and she was not allowed to say pregnant on the show. That was seen as too offensive. She had to say that she was expecting. So really what this is about is it's about the advertisers. It's not really about what the audience will tolerate. Probably the audience would have tolerated the word pregnant in the 1950s. It's really about advertisers not wanting their products associated with imagery that's going to have a negative impact on the bottom line, the profit margin. So for example, Tide detergent, big white Tide detergent, that's a product made by Procter & Gamble. That's the parent company. They want that product used in every household. They don't even want you knowing about Procter & Gamble. They just want you to think, if I need detergent, I need Tide. So Tide advertises a lot on TV shows, and they want a clean white image. So they're not going to associate with any programming, any content that is determined to be, morally degrading or dirty, right? Both metaphorically and also literally. That standard has changed over the year, and Tide will accommodate a lot more, but that still today is why we have a big resistance and why we cannot hear what is considered to be offensive content, swear words, profanity, why we can't see sexual scenes on television, even though that would be part of a normal family circumstance with two people who are in love, two people dating, whatever. So we don't see that. We're going to come back and talk about obscenity later when we get to the regulation of media later on in the course, and we're going to talk about obscenity quite extensively. Now that takes us to wrapping up the class with the future of television. We know that it's going to be interactive. It already is. I mean, you're interacting with your TV in ways that you didn't before. And some people say the interaction still has a lag to it. I mean, go to Netflix and you're still typing in letter after letter after letter to get it to search for your movies. Still not very user-friendly, but at least you're not just sitting there, right? You are interacting with TV. You're touching the screen of your television. You're on your cell phone tweeting about a sport that you're watching with a friend who's in another city. You're giving them hell because they're an opponent. We are interacting a lot more. We also know that convergence is going to continue to take place as well in the television world. That convergence is the idea of everything coming together content-wise to be distributed to a single medium. We see convergence going on the cell phone, but we also see it on the TV because the TV is bringing in the internet. They still haven't figured out a clean way to do it with the aspect ratio of the television, the size of the TV versus the size of the computer, and getting shows to translate over. But we know that everything's coming into that central, that converging space of what we call a television. We may call it something else later. Whether it will remain in our rooms is yet to be seen. I mean, when the hologram comes out, forget it, because it's going to be the hologram that's going to be on the coffee table, right? And no more TV screens, but that's in the future. Have a great day.